What we're doing here in the Philippines is about primarily terrorism, but it's also about interoperability of our armed forces when they are, affected by any particular issue. Even in terms of disaster relief, that's where the armed forces of the Philippines and Australia have come together when you've had typhoons or earthquakes, where we've come and sent people up here. But the focus, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, has been, and even a bit before that, has been terrorism, particularly down south, and how do we deal with that? And that goes from defence to security, also with the National Police and the other intelligence agencies of the Philippines, but looking at what we can do in practical ways to help you address terrorism. And so that's been very, very important. When Marawi occurred back in April, May of 2017, the Australian military really stepped up its commitment to the Philippines, and that was an extraordinary period for the Philippines and very, very confronting indeed. And I feel for the people of Marawi in terms of what occurred there. But that's when the United States, I leave the United States to talk for itself, but Australia came to the aid of the Philippines, and we worked closely together to support you deal with that crisis. That then led to a whole range of cooperation flowing from that, which continues to this day and will continue pretty much on into the future. So we decided that we should cooperate with the armed forces of the Philippines, particularly in terms of urban warfare and counter-terrorism training. And in the period since, I think, 2017, we've now trained about 8,500 Filipino armed servicemen in counter-terrorism activities, so that if you ever confronted a situation like Marawi or something like that, you would have the skill set to be able to do so.
Tell us more about Marawi, the Marawi experience, and the Australian government's participation in settling that conflict.
Yeah, so as
because
Marawi...
we heard the President talk about the Russian help and the Chinese help, and in some way of course, the United States assistance. Tell us about the Australian
Ed, you'll be aware, and I think you mentioned it in your introduction, that we provided a couple of planes that provided support to the troops down on the ground by identifying, what was happening down there. And that enabled the armed forces of the Philippines to protect itself as it was going into the city, and then to understand the nature of what was going on down south.
This is the Orion, the P3 Orion.
Yeah, that's correct. And so that was very, very useful to the Philippines Armed Forces, and helped, together with the Americans, obviously, to resolve that conflict. I've been down to Marawi, as we've said, a couple of times. Nothing really prepares you for the extent of the devastation down in Marawi, and that was one of the reasons, that our minister at the time committed vast sums of money, $30 million, to Marawi for the reconstruction, because Marawi is 96 hectares, 24 of which are the most affected area. That 24 hectares is pretty much completely destroyed.
Up to now, actually.
So, yeah, it was interesting. I went down in March. That was the first time I went there, and there was some progress, but not so much. I then went back with the Chief of the Defence Force 11 weeks later, and the amount of change was really quite dramatic. So about 22% of the most affected area had been cleared, and there was trucks and demolition equipment all over the place. That was really very, very heartening.
But do you feel the terrorist threat has been significantly diminished? I mean, we just had a suicide bombing.
Yeah,
I think for the first time, Filipinos were involved in a suicide bombing.
It would be a brave person to say that the terrorist threat has diminished significantly. We're all working together as a group across Southeast Asia to try and diminish the terrorist threat. But I think it's an ongoing problem, and it's going to be with us for many, many, many years, maybe forever. And what's happening is that the terrorists morph in terms of the way in which they think about the nature of their attacks and what they're going to do. People coming back from the Middle East is an issue. People joining various groups down in the south is an issue.
What has Australia learned in those programs to try to combat extremism that you think is important to remind the Philippine government in the context of Marawi?
So, reaching out to the communities and reaching out to all the potential people who could be encouraged to join terrorist groups because of their circumstances and their environment. It's one of the things that's very important down in the south of the Philippines, that people who are unemployed, who have limited education, who have no real future, and that's why the looking after the people around Marawi is so important, that they not be enticed to join terrorist groups because it gives them something to do and they're offered some funds. So therefore finding alternative ways to give them employment, think about their future, educate them in ways that gives them more opportunities, changes all of that. You know, we've spent a lot of time in Australia thinking about how do you counter violent extremism, how do you get into communities and work to ensure that people aren't radicalised. It's tough and it's a constant effort that's required. Here in the Philippines there's lots of work being done on countering violent extremism. How do you potentially stop somebody who's going to be attracted to terrorism? But it goes to the nature of their environment, the education that you provide, the support that's available to them, and their perception of their future. That becomes really quite critical in what's going to be, you know, the decision point for them as to whether they're going to be radicalised or otherwise.